Herbie Hancock.
Your first record as a leader, 1962. Of course, you'd played on some Blue Note records prior to that, on some Donald Byrd sessions. First record was a hit record, The Cut Watermelon Man.
Yeah, it did real well, much to my surprise and the record company's surprise. Actually, my record was in the top 100 of the pop charts. They only had pop charts at that time.
Right, there were no jazz charts.
Right, there were no jazz charts. There weren't any R&B charts. I don't think there were even any country charts. That I don't remember for sure. I only remember there was just the pop charts. They didn't have it all subdivided into different things, you know. And it was, I think, as high as 80 or 76 or something like that. And then Mungo Santa Maria recorded it, and his went through the roof. Then his was version got to be number 10, I think. 9 or 10. It was in the top 10.
There was something different about your little approach there, though. The rhythm in Watermelon Man was a little different.
Yeah, well, I had originally just conceived it as a kind of funky jazz tune. That's all. But either just before the record was released or just after, I got a gig with Mungo Santa Maria. I played with him one weekend. And I had never played Latin music before, never played with a Latin band. And he was between piano players. One guy was quitting, and the other guy that was coming to replace him, a guy named Rogers Grant, was coming to replace him, who was a guy I knew, too. Rogers lived in my building in the Bronx. He lived downstairs on the second floor, I think, or second or third floor, and Donald Byrd and I lived on the 5th floor. Walk up, no elevator. Right? It was in those days. So anyway, I knew Rogers was coming in, and I replaced some piano player. I didn't find out till about maybe 6 or 7 years ago who the piano player was that I replaced. Now this incident happened in 1963, I guess.
A year after your version of Watermelon Man was released, or during the year it was released.
Yeah, during the year it was released. Anyway, so I played this gig with Mungo, and we played, actually there were 3 gigs I played, three nights I played with Mungo. One night we played in the Bronx, where Donald Byrd and I lived. Donald Byrd was my roommate, see? So we lived in the Bronx, and Donald came by to hear. Donald was like my older brother, you know. And he used to laugh at me a lot because I was kind of young and green to New York, you know. But he kind of watched over me, so he came by the gig, and between shows, he and Mungo got into this very serious conversation about the relationship between Afro-Cuban music and Afro-American music, you know. Slave ships went to both places, you know, where's that link between the two? And Mungo had never found it. So I sort of half listened to the conversation. It was a little too heavy for me, you know. And Donald finally says, Herbie, why don't you play Watermelon Man for Mungo? I said, what? Play Watermelon Man for Mungo. I said, what's that got to do with what you... He said, play it. So I said, okay. Because I conceived of it as a kind of funky jazz tune. So I went and started playing it. Mungo gets up, he says, keep playing it. He walks over to his congas. As soon as he started playing the congas, it fit like a hand in a glove. Just perfectly. And then little by little, his band members joined in. The bass player started watching the notes I was playing in my left hand and checking out the form. So he picked up the bass line. And then the horn players picked up the melody line, and somebody started soloing. And little by little, the people, it was a supper club. So, you know, people danced. So little by little, people got up from the tables and started getting on the floor. Pretty soon, everybody was dancing and screaming and hollering because they loved the tune. And then Mungo, after that, he said, this is a wahira, you know, which is a type of country song they sing in the mountains. And I said, a what? I had no idea, you know, about any of this. And so he said, can I record it? I said, sure. So he recorded it.
That almost sounds like a scene from a movie, the scene you just described in the club with Mungo and everybody and it falling together. I mean.
Yeah, it was. It was blowing my mind. It reminded me of these, you know, very romantic ideas about stardom or something like that.
Yeah,
You know?
well, exactly.
You know, movies like Marjorie Morningstar and you know, all this. It reminded me of that. I mean, but that actually happened like that. I mean, people would, I mean, on the dance, they were actually screaming, and women were going, hugging me and saying it's a hit, and saying things like that. It was phenomenal, you know.
That's amazing, because so much of your story personally is out of the normal realm of what a jazz player would normally experience in their lifetime.
Exactly. I know that. And it completely blew my mind. And I love that experience, but of course I didn't sit there and think, okay, I got a hit in my hands. You can't go around thinking that. I mean, nobody knows the secret to that. But when he recorded it, the thing came out, and it was a hit. That was unusual anyway. It's always been unusual that an instrumental would be a hit. But for some reason, I've been able to make hits with instrumentals. Not often. I mean, it's like every 10 years I come out with something. You know, and that happened in 63. The hit on this album was 73. And the Future Shock album with Rocket was 83.
After this hit happened for you, you became involved in another series of records that, in terms of the jazz world, were probably in many ways more monumental than the success of Watermelon Man. Watermelon Man was nice. It was a jazz record that did real well, and when a jazz record does well, it's good for all jazz players.
Right.
But the records that you made, particularly starting with the Maiden Voyage period, seemed to really mark something else for jazz players too. It was a period where the chord changes in the traditional way suddenly fell aside, and there was more of a mood or a group spirit starting to happen.
Yeah, a lot of that happened. Well, first of all, the same year that Watermelon Man became a hit, that was the year I joined Miles Davis's band. And that was a very, very important step in my own musical development. Because of Miles and because of all the other guys in the band. Ron Carter on bass, Tony Williams drums. First George Coleman and then Wayne Shorter on saxophone. You know, and I was 23 in 1963. So those years with Miles, those 5.5 years with Miles, were my formative years. But I had my own record contract with Blue Note Records. Incidentally, when I did Watermelon Man, that was a one-shot deal.
Really?
Yeah, it was just for one record. But the record did well, so they asked me to sign a full contract with them.
That's a good position to negotiate from. Too.
Yeah. It was very good. So anyway, so I had my own recordings that I did under my own name, and I also recorded with Miles Davis's band. And a phenomenon that a lot of people may not realize is that if you play as a sideman with somebody else's band, but you also record on your own, quite often, the songs that you record on your own, for your own solo contract, the music never gets to be played live because you're playing with somebody else's band. So you record that stuff and you never get to play it anymore. Unless the guy whose band you're playing with is also playing some of your music, and somehow some of it might be included. But most of the songs that I did on the, all those albums I did for Blue Note while I was with Miles, I never got to play. Unless I got a trio gig somewhere, which was not that often. Sometimes when I was in New York and Miles wasn't working, I'd get a chance to work for a week at the Village Vanguard or something. And then I might get a chance to play Speak Like a Child and Maiden Voyage and a few other of my tunes. But normally I would never play Maiden Voyage because we didn't play it with Miles's band.
There's one song that was on both Maiden Voyage and the Miles Davis ESP record. That's the song Little One.
Right. That's one of the few.
But that album, ESP, was a real watershed album for Miles, too, I think. And for yourself as well. Jazz turned a corner at that point, it seemed.
Yeah, I remember before we recorded the album ESP, I remember we worked one time in Detroit. This was before Wayne was in the band. I'm trying to think, was that the first album that Wayne did?
Yes.
Right, okay, then this explains it. That was the first one that Wayne did with Miles's band. Okay, we were in Detroit. George Coleman was still playing tenor saxophone with Miles. And Tony Williams, Ron and I would play differently behind George than we would behind Miles.
Mm-hmm.
Behind Miles, we would play in a way that was more reminiscent of what we were accustomed to hearing behind Miles. I would be thinking more in terms of Wynton Kelly and Bill Evans, that kind of thing. Tony was thinking more in terms of Philly Joe and Jimmy Cobb, and Ron more in terms of Paul Chambers. Although Ron's approach reminds me in many ways of Paul Chambers, but further developed. On one hand, further developed. On the other hand,
Yeah.
Paul was a great genius at the bass. It was incredible. Some of the things he did weren't really touched by anybody. It was just things that he could do.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody really knew what it was he was doing. It was fantastic. But anyway, this one gig we were playing in Detroit, and behind George, we would really open up. Sometimes not even play the time. We play all kinds of figures and things, but rhythmic figures behind George. Do things that were considered more toward the avant-garde. Things that were maybe more expected of a sound that you'd hear behind John Coltrane.
That was the era.
Yeah, exactly. See, those were the two bands, Train's band and Miles's band. And
That's right. And at that point, when you were with Miles's band, you were playing a lot of the old standard tunes just at blazing tempos. You were just
Right.
trying to push them, like trying to get through some sort of barrier maybe or something.
yeah, we still played Miles's repertoire.
You playing So What and
Right.
Valentine.
Yeah, and If I Were a Bell and Autumn Leaves, all
Yeah.
of those things. Actually, what was happening was we would play freer behind George Coleman than we would behind Miles. And one day Miles said, "Why don't you play behind me the way you play behind George?" And I looked at Tony, and Tony said, "Really?"
Uh-huh.
We said, "Okay." So we started doing that stuff. I mean, playing with the rhythms and doing all kinds of wild things behind Miles, things that we never heard on Miles's records before. And in the beginning, I remember Miles started bobbing and weaving and trying to find a place in that stuff and kind of starting and stopping, and he was really being thrown by it. And the second day, we just continued to do it. He wanted it, so we continued. Next day, there was less bobbing and weaving. He was finding some stuff. By the third day, not only was he not bobbing and weaving, I was the one bobbing and weaving and trying to find my place, because Miles had it then. He found a way to play in that context that had me trying to figure out what he was doing. And right after we played that set, that third night, Miles said, "I don't want to play any chords anymore." I said, "Okay, And the next album was ESP, where there weren't really chords.
And there were no more chords after that.
Mm-hmm.
The Headhunters album is an example, in a way, of not doing chords in the traditional way and using a lot of techniques that were maybe foreign to traditional jazz players at that time. And
certainly the use of electronics.
I remember when the album came out, a stunning success, obviously. I think the biggest selling record of all time was when it came out, a jazz record.
Right, it was, yeah.
But more than that, using the kind of studio techniques was a first for jazz, and I spoke at that time with David Rubinson, who worked with you on it, about how the record came to be. And he said, we did everything possible to make that record. If there was a trick in the studio, we used it. We did it. Cutting up takes, doing overdubs, whatever.
Yeah, we did a lot of different kinds of things with effects and using the technology that was available at that time, which normally was not applied to jazz records. First of all, the reason that David Rubinson was well, first he was my record producer. The reason he was suggested to me as a producer of my records is because I moved from Blue Note Records to Warner Brothers Records. And I did an album called Fat Albert Rotunda, which was a re-recording of music I did for the first Fat Albert animated special that Bill Cosby did, which was done, I think, in 1969 or early 1970. I don't know exactly when. The record didn't do so well. It actually sold about as well as Maiden Voyage did. But this was not Blue Note Records anymore. This was Warner Brothers. That's the big time, you know,
Yeah.
the big guys.
Yeah.
Those kind of sales are not good enough for them, you know. And so they thought that maybe if they got me a record producer that had a broad enough taste and broad enough understanding of music and a broad enough commitment to music to be able to relate to what I'm doing and that I could relate to him, but at the same time they thought maybe he could kind of pull me over to doing some more commercial stuff, right? The funny thing was, after I met David Rubenson, I did the least commercial stuff that I ever did. Because the next album, which David Rubenson, who was the first one that David Rubenson produced for me, was in Wandishi. That was a whole lot less commercial than Fat Albert Rotunda. But what happened in the meantime was David Rubenson heard my sextet, and we were playing a very avant-garde music that completely captivated him. And then he became a champion of our cause, instead of him being a champion of the record company's cause. But at the same time, his problem was he really wanted to stand up for what we were doing because he thought it was valuable. But he's thinking, how can we make this music as palatable as it can be without changing the music? So we're always trying to think of things to do. That was one reason why we got into electronics, because electronics was associated with rock and roll.
Just the physical,
synthesizers,
the sound of the stuff.
Yeah, just the sound of the stuff. And so if we felt like if we could do anything that could link us somehow with a wider audience, as weird as that music was, it could possibly help sales. And you never know what can happen. You know, sometimes you take someone who knows nothing about the kind of music you're doing, their hearing can be sometimes so pure that it can just go right to their heart and they can just really love it without having any kind of intellectual understanding of it. And that kind of music, even though a lot of intellect went into the playing of it, the purpose of it was really non-intellectual. It was pure emotional, you know.
I think a good example and a distinction between where you came from and where you started heading is the version of Watermelon Man from that record. Talk about the connection between that kind of approach and the approach you were doing at the same time playing with what we would call more straight-ahead bands. I mean, are they two different directions? Are they the same direction?
Well, when I did Maiden Voyage, one type of approach to rhythm really was close to my heart and still is. It's integrated with a harmonic approach too, which is one you described before, having to do with a floating feeling, kind of a putting aside of the traditional harmonies of jazz and making it kind of a mood. A lot of that harmony was could be related to a technical word in music, which is modal music, you know, having to do with modes. And that started with it really in jazz with Miles. As a formal approach in jazz, it started with Miles' album, Kind of Blue. And that album had a big effect on me too, because I love that sound, you know. But now Maiden Voyage, when I did Maiden Voyage, here's how I'll tie this in with Watermelon Man. When I did Maiden Voyage, I was looking for a way to have a pop tune that didn't have a backbeat on the second and the fourth beat. I was looking for a backbeat on other beats. That's what I was looking for. But in the meantime, I found something that didn't really fulfill that requirement. But see, I was playing around with putting beats on different parts of the musical phrase, and that's how I did the rhythm of Maiden Voyage, which is da da I was thinking maybe I could use that as a backbeat, but I put chords to that. When I put chords to that, I heard it in a very different way. But what I heard, I liked, so I said, okay, forget about trying to find a backbeat. Let me do this. This has something to work with, you know. So I worked with the song as it was, and it wound up being Maiden Voyage. But I was really trying to find a rhythm that would revolutionize what we call a backbeat, which is the beat that you normally clap your hands on 2 and 4. And the other thing that related it to a song like Watermelon Man is that it contains what we call even eighth notes. Whereas in jazz, you'd have traditional jazz, the swing beat goes ding ding a 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 ding. And when you say even eighth notes, it would be dan ding ka dan ding ka dan ding ka dan instead of dan ding ka dan ding ka dan ding ka dan dan ding ka dan ding ka so they're even. You're right.
Watermelon Man. There it is. Sure.
So that even eighth note sound links together a song like Maiden Voyage, or Speak Like a Child, or Watermelon Man, Rocket.
So that all through your career, there's been this thread, this even eighth note thread that has been the thread that's in some ways stitched together the major successes you had.
Right.
After the success of Headhunters, your ability to work and the ways you worked and the types of gigs you played, I'm sure it changed dramatically. I mean, when you sell 1 million records, you're not playing the bebop clubs anymore. And
yeah, a lot of things changed. I remember one of the first concerts that I did after I did Headhunters, and we were working opposite, I think, a couple of other groups. I think in Philly. And I walked in there, and one of the opening acts was on, and I looked at that audience. I said, "Wow, there's a lot of people here." I said, "Who's the headliner?" I thought I was one of the opening acts. I said, "Who's headlining this show?" I said to David Rubenstein. He says, "Don't you know what's happening here? You're headlining this show." He said, "All those people came to see you." I said, "Come on, you're kidding." Because it was a concert. I was used to playing clubs with like 200 people at the most. This was like thousands of people. When do they come? They're coming to see me? He said, "You have a hit record. Don't you know this?" It was so foreign to me, I just didn't understand it. And I had never played for that many, but I had played for that many people because I'd played, Newport Festival and some other festivals in Chicago, but this was a whole different ballgame. I was the headliner of this. And after that, my club work almost completely disappeared. I didn't do any clubs after that. In the beginning, I did a few, but they were very large clubs. And what I wound up doing was mostly concerts. And at the same time, that scene began to change for jazz too, because other jazz musicians began playing mostly concerts. Miles was already playing. I think, he was already playing his electric music at the time.
Absolutely.
Chick Corea was playing his electric music. Weather Report was maybe hadn't quite gotten formed yet, but they were in the process of getting formed. So the type of music that became known as jazz fusion was born.
And so we entered an era in the 70s where people thought that acoustic jazz was in the past, and many people with a lot of trepidation looked toward the future of the music as being something that would be totally devoid of the values of acoustic playing and improvisation and chord changes.
Yeah, the only people that thought that were the people who weren't still going to the clubs, and the musicians who weren't jazz musicians playing in the clubs. But anybody who was on the jazz scene knew that that wasn't true, because the music was still going on. It just wasn't getting the recognition. In other words, the traditional form of of jazz wasn't getting the recognition that this new form was getting, because the new form related a little more easily toward the most popular form of music at that time, which was rock and roll.
Yes. The classic jazz that's represented by that music, I guess classic is a loose phrase, but we're all accepting it these days, brings us, I guess, inevitably to the music Round Midnight. Round Midnight was a film that they said couldn't be made because it was about real people making real music, and it wasn't a happy ending, and there was no duck that came down and gave anybody $1 million in that movie.
Right.
What was the experience overall of making that movie like for you? Was it tedious and a lot of hard work, as movies are, or was it inspirational?
It was everything that you said. It was tedious, it was hard, it was exciting, it was inspiring, all of those things. The one thing that dominated everything is sincerity. Everybody that participated in this film, whether they were musicians or not, whether they were actors, whether they knew about jazz or not, really put their heart and soul into that music, into that film, because they felt the significance of the music that we call jazz and the dedication of the participants throughout the years. And they were all moved, they were all touched and excited. And the camaraderie was so great, so strong during the filming of that movie, that many of the actors who had completed their part for the film would show up the next week or a few days later just to be on the set and hang out and just to be a part of it. Nobody wanted to leave, you know. They all wanted to stay there.
A minute ago you misspoke. You said the music, and then you corrected yourself by saying the film was. That, I think, is no accident in a way. It's one of the few movies where the music isn't tacked on. It's at the heart of it. It's actually being played in the middle of the film.
Right, exactly. Bertrand Tavernier wanted to capture the spirit of improvised jazz. And I think he did it in many, many ways in the film. I wasn't aware of it at the time. There were certain things I was aware of, and I would describe those. One of them is Bertrand listened to everything that the musicians said on and off the set. He revised the script constantly according to many suggestions that we made. Dexter made certain suggestions, some certain major ones, you know, that made the points in the film stronger. There's one scene in the film where Dexter, the first time he goes over to, Dale Turner is the character.
Mm-hmm.
First time he goes over to Francis's house, and Dale Turner says to Francis, he says, "Francis, is there water in this wine?" In the script, Francis says, "No." But before we shot that scene, Dexter had a conversation with Bertrand. And Dexter said, "Bertrand, if Dale Turner says to Francis, 'Did you put water in the wine?' If Francis lies, the first time he asked him a serious question like that, Dale would never trust him again." He says, "Francis has to say yes for it to be real." Bertrand said, "Of course, you're absolutely right." And he changed it. So he says yes in the film. And it makes the rest of it make sense. You know? So Bertrand had this sense to take heed of how musicians really are.
I guess my final question to you, is it simply a past reality, or is there some future reality to it as well? I mean, this vision of jazz musicians hanging out and being relaxed and playing in clubs, is it gone?
I wouldn't bet too heavily on that. I can't make a firm speculation about the life of the club scene. But I can tell you this, because many things have changed. Now many musicians are also educators. You know, they teach in schools. I think it's very good.
More than the club scene, though, the way guys used to learn music and the way jazz
That's
was
different.
was passed on from sideman to sideman or whatever.
That is different. That is different. We used to have jam sessions. That doesn't exist anymore.
People learn music from records now
Now they
on
learn
radio.
from records, and it's
So
not the same. But what is amazing is that somehow it still works. Because how do you think Wynton Marsalis and Branford Marsalis learned? They learned from records. The funny thing is that many times records have a perfection that is not representative of the average playing or average performance of musicians, or even the type of music. It has its good points and it has its bad points. You can give a performance in front of an audience that is far greater than what you can do on a record which is recorded in a studio. But still, there's a kind of professionalism in recordings. Somebody told me a story about Art Tatum, because he's blind. He heard some pieces of music that were recorded by duo pianists, 4 hands, and he thought that there was one guy playing all that stuff, and so he wound up playing piano with 2 hands as though they were 4, because he didn't know that that's not what it was. And maybe this is why Wynton and Branford at such a young age play so well, because they've heard records that didn't have a lot of the mistakes that musicians might make in a normal, average performing situation.
That's interesting, where
Yeah.
the good news could be the bad news in a way.
Yeah. See, I couldn't play like that when I was that age.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody that could. I mean, the younger players are coming up now that play better at a younger age than the previous generations could at that age.
On the other hand, jazz musicians have said for years the mistakes are the only part that's jazz.
That's funny.